Electric cars are an oddly polarizing topic. 65% of people have never driven one, and many of them clash with the few that know the truth about electric cars. But today is not a day for politics, it's a day for truth, and some people are about to learn just how wrong they are. Hello people of the internet, I'm Nico, a former electrical engineering student, and this is all the misconceptions about EVs that are actually wrong. Starting off with the production of batteries, and yes, I know, the production produces a lot of CO2. I'll get to the emissions later, but first I need to talk about the claim that there isn't enough lithium to meet the demand for all the batteries being produced. It's not strictly true because there's actually more than enough lithium on Earth. According to the president of Global Lithium, the trouble is actually with mining enough of it to keep up with the demand. The process of mining and refining lithium is still too slow. But even if there were not enough lithium, there are other materials to make batteries out of. Graphene Manufacturing Group has developed batteries using aluminum, which is one of the most abundant metals on Earth. The other thing to note is that lithium-ion batteries are recyclable, which helps lessen the blow of limited resources. But I'll get to the recycling later in the video because it is rather complicated. But back to these aluminum batteries, unfortunately they aren't planned to reach EVs until 2024. Currently we still have lithium-ion batteries which allegedly degrade significantly over time. Another claim that simply isn't true. Yes, they do degrade over time, but it's nowhere near as much as you may have been led to believe. According to Tesla, over the course of 200,000 miles, their batteries lose about 10% capacity, so even at 200,000 miles you really wouldn't need a battery replacement. A point in which a gas-powered car may have had transmission work or an entire engine swap done. Now, engine swaps and battery swaps are both very expensive jobs, but a battery swap would likely be the only maintenance cost of an electric car, so it would still be cheaper to own than a gas-powered car. Let me prove it to you. Starting with gasoline cars, according to AAA, the yearly cost of running an average run-of-the-mill sedan is over $8,000, $8,558 to be specific. Now, this takes into consideration depreciation, fuel, insurance, maintenance, taxes and registration, tires, and finance charges. But for the purposes of fairness, I'm going to take out the finance, tires, insurance, depreciation, and registration, as all of these things will also factor into the cost of EVs. So now we have fuel, maintenance, and taxes, the three items where EVs and gas-powered cars will actually differ. Now, on the basis that you drive 1,200 miles per month and that the cost of electricity is 15 cents per kilowatt hour, you would be spending $45 a month to run your EV. Compare that to a gas-powered car that gets, say, 25 miles per gallon, a pretty middle-of-the-run figure, you would be spending just over $180 per month if you use the average gas price in the US of $3.79. Then if you include maintenance, EVs win yet again. According to the US Department of Energy, EVs cost about 6 cents per mile to run, whereas gas-powered cars cost about 10 cents per mile. So over the course of 15,000 miles per year, the national average here in the US, an EV would save you about $600 per year. Now that's not massive, but it is enough to buy you this money tracker on Amazon so you can keep track of how much money you've saved. There are still tax benefits, but these are very dependent on your financial situation, how expensive the EV is that you buy, and many other factors, all of which I covered in my EV tax credit video. There's a link below the like button, and I'll also link it in the end screen so you can watch it after this video. But back to EVs, while they may save you a good amount of money, many people are skeptical about the environmental benefits. After all, the majority of our energy here in the US is produced from various different fossil fuel types. Well, in terms of CO2 emissions, EVs are actually cleaner. And on top of that, your gas-powered car does more damage than you may have thought. Let's go in chronological order, from production to end of life. For an EV, you can expect the CO2 emissions to be 1.5 times to twice as much as a gas car during the production phase, which is not a good start for EVs, but it soon turns around. Now, using the average annual distance driven of 15,000 miles, a standard Toyota Camry would produce over 5 metric tons of CO2 per year from tailpipe emissions alone. By comparison, a Chevy Bolt would produce 1.8 metric tons of CO2 per year with the average US electricity mix. Here's where it gets interesting. The one thing that is often not considered with internal combustion engine cars is the CO2 emissions of producing the fuel that is later burned. There's a rather extensive study on this, which I have linked in the description, but the website I found this study on summarized it, and it turns out that, quote, you must add 30% for gasoline and 24% for diesel in order to arrive at the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So the Toyota Camry doesn't actually produce 5 tons of CO2 every year, it produces 6.5 tons every year, considerably more than the 1.8 tons of the Chevy Bolt. Now with that in mind, if a Toyota Camry produces 8 tons of CO2 during production and the Chevy Bolt produces twice as much, it'll take less than 2 years for the Chevy Bolt to make up the difference of CO2 emissions. It's worth noting that this is generalized math, and depending on which specific cars you use in your calculations, the value is subject to change. But my point still stands. EVs produce far less CO2 in the long run, and they make up the difference pretty quickly. Now comes the big one, the power grid, and whether or not it can even handle the surplus of electric cars. Now it is true that there are several cases where the power grid could not handle the charging of electric cars in certain conditions. The classic example would be California and their recent heat wave, where to avoid rolling blackouts, citizens were asked to stop unnecessary energy consumption. This included the charging of EVs at home, since the energy was needed for people to run their air conditioning. In those extreme cases, during heat waves for example, it's true, the grid does not supply enough electricity. However, as heat waves are, for now at least, an occasional event, and if the people who have garage space just charge overnight, then this isn't an issue. A tactic local governments use to keep blackouts from happening is by having varying rates for electricity throughout the day to incentivize people to not charge during the peak hours. So while it is true that in extreme scenarios during peak hours the grid does not provide enough electricity, most of the time, and with current incentive strategies, the grid is not a major concern for the time being. Also, as we naturally and gradually consume more energy every year, the grid is being constantly upgraded and will continue to be improved as the demand for electricity increases. If you watched my previous video, you would know there were some incorrect statements I made in my video highlighting the issues with electric cars. What I had gotten wrong was the units of efficiency, which seems odd at first because I used miles per gallon. But in truth, the better way to measure efficiency is distance covered per kilowatt hour of energy used. Let me show you what I'm on about. An EV like a Nissan Leaf has an estimated range of about 200 miles and has a 62 kilowatt hour capacity battery. Now that doesn't mean much without some context, so let me compare this to a gasoline car. Take a Volkswagen Jetta for example. It has an estimated range of about 550 miles and has a 13.2 gallon fuel tank. Now, if you didn't know, a gallon of gasoline contains roughly 33 kilowatt hours of energy. So, in the Jetta's 13.2 gallon fuel tank, it can effectively hold 435.6 kilowatt hours of energy, meaning that the Jetta can drive 1.26 miles per kilowatt hour, whereas the little Nissan Leaf can go 3.22 miles per kilowatt hour. Clearly, electric is more efficient, and that should not be a surprise, because internal combustion engine cars burn up 70% of the energy they get as heat. So of the $100 you spent on gas, $70 got burned up and you didn't move an inch. Where EVs fall short is simply that batteries aren't as energy dense as gasoline. So despite their efficiency advantage, gasoline-powered cars can still travel further on one fill-up. And on the subject of batteries, the big question is what happens to the batteries after an EV's life cycle is over? Well, I've seen several people on the internet immediately say landfills, but the truth is that they don't. Tesla themselves say that none of the batteries they have produced have gone to a landfill, and so they end up in rather amazing places with impressive uses. Sometimes they get bought to be used in electric conversions, like the electric Humvee that Jerry Rig Everything made about a year ago. Normally though, they end up as electricity storage for buildings. The Johan Cruyff Arena, the home stadium of Ajax Football Club, is a great example. Their stadium is now the largest energy storage system in Europe with the use of 148 Nissan Leaf battery packs. Then after the second life that battery packs often live, they end up in recycling. This is the tricky bit because recycling is a horribly expensive and dangerous process as of right now. The chemicals make it very difficult to have an OSHA-approved work environment, but steps are being taken to make recycling easier. There are 3 methods to recycle batteries as of right now. The first one is hydrometallurgy, a horrible word and a horrible process using acid to retrieve the materials, and it has a nasty side product of hazardous gases. Despite the complexity though, it can retrieve over 99% of the cobalt and lithium and is considered to be the most suitable method for recycling spent lithium-ion batteries. The next method is pyrometallurgy, which as the pyro part suggests uses extreme heat to extract materials. Also not good for protecting the environment. There is another method known as direct recycling, but that is apparently not quite ready yet for widespread adoption as it still poses some challenges for recyclers. There are some more concerns with EVs to quickly mention, such as the materials, specifically cobalt, which are mined using child labor. Big yikes. Then the processing of those materials is still done almost entirely by China, but the Inflation Reduction Act aims to change that. If If you want to know everything else that the Inflation Reduction Act is changing, then I would suggest watching my video on that. There's a link in the description and also in the top right hand corner of the screen. In conclusion, there are still some things to work out with recycling and possibly the power grid to make sure that charging during peak hours isn't an issue. But aside from that, EVs already beat internal combustion engine cars in almost every measurable way. As the economies of scale kick in, EV prices will drop. They are already cleaner in terms of CO2 emissions, they are significantly more efficient and cheaper to maintain. It's only a matter of time before there are enough charging stations, before charging speeds are negligible, and before the battery capacity increases to the point where our gas-powered cars become completely obsolete. And when that happens, it will be one of the saddest days of my life because I will know that my passion has just become a history lesson. But that story is better saved for a future video. Share this video with anyone you know that needs convincing about EVs. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Until next time, people of the internet, peace out.